Hi, Rob.
Mike.
Hello. Thank you for joining us, everybody. For those of you who don't know who BMS are, we are a leading sales specialist and marketing recruitment consultancy. We've been established for in excess of 30 years, and on the sales side, we recruit at all levels. So I am the National Sales Manager at BMS. My name's Mike Leather. I've been here for just under 10 years now, and joining me today is Rob Coombs. He's one of our market development managers, one of the very few market development managers that we have, and he's been with us just under 9 years, haven't you, Rob?
I certainly have, yes.
Yeah. So we wanted to come on and put together a webinar, which is based on our experiences, and what we've seen in the market to ultimately help employers recruit in what is an ever-changing candidate market at the moment. Isn't that right, Rob?
Yeah, it's certainly tricky for businesses to be recruiting in this sector and in this time. So hopefully, yeah, we're giving our best foot forward in attacking that ever-changing and evolving marketplace.
Yeah, and there's going to be plenty of actionable takeaways for people as well, so that hopefully you can come away from this with some new information that you might not have known.
Absolutely.
Next point that we wanted to talk about today, which we both felt was a really important one, is the difference between an applicant and a candidate. I wanted to talk about this firstly because the market is very much still candidate driven. So what do I mean by candidate driven? Essentially, it means that there isn't enough good caliber candidates to fill the amount of vacancies that are out there, which results in candidates being picky, being selective, and ultimately harder to recruit for employers. When we look at, I guess, the last 12 months particularly, and I reckon you'll back me up on this, Rob, definitely seen a shift in the overall talent pool. So if we consider an applicant as a candidate that's actively on the market, and a candidate as someone who is in a passive part of the candidate pool, the overall talent pool, the overall size of the market has decreased. It just means that there's more candidates that are in the passive section. So for clients at the moment and companies that are out there recruiting, it's important that we feel that people are aware of this, because often what we'll find, won't we, Rob, is that when we speak to a client and we ask them how they're going about recruiting for a position, they've got an advert on LinkedIn, and that's about it. And for that reason, they're harnessing a small portion of the overall talent pool. So how can they be sure that they're recruiting the very best salesperson out there? So Rob, if we keep again applicants and candidates separate, what are some of the things that companies need to be thinking about in order to access a higher portion of the applicant market?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's got quite a lot of potential answers and takeaways from it. I mean, you mentioned advertising there. Obviously, that advert itself has got to be really well written for the target audience, of course, but also for the role, but more importantly, so it accesses the right level of person or people that said advert is aiming to get out there. So many times, I mean, how many adverts do we see, especially with our BD team, that looking at adverts of companies that not very much in depth and quite small and don't actually tell you what it's doing, where it's doing, or what the kind of package is. So having that advert well written is key. We've also talked about popping something on LinkedIn. Well, not everybody uses LinkedIn. We'd like to think they do, but having it in multiple places, multiple job boards, multiple places for your target market. And I think one that we will touch on this today, that strength of employer brand. Is your LinkedIn profile showcasing your company? Have you got an easy to navigate careers page? I mean, the amount of websites I've been on because I know where they are, because I've looked to them. They're usually right at the bottom. Is it clear as day as to where it is? So if you're going on there, you can find it. And about the online profile and reviews, candidates these days and applicants these days know more than ever because of social media and what have you.
Yeah.
So what's your online footprint looking like? And are you abreast of what people think about you on places like Glassdoor or Google Reviews, Review Centre, etc.?
100%, because you can get a candidate who sees your advert online, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, might visit your LinkedIn page and they don't get all the information that they would expect to be attracted to the position for them to then follow through with their application. On the candidate side, so this can be a bit more tricky, because if we remember, a candidate being someone that's passive is not going out there applying for job adverts. So this is a large portion of the talent pool of candidates that are essentially sat there and getting approaches from recruiters, from direct employers on LinkedIn. And this is one of the biggest shifts that we've seen in candidate behavior. Because of the lack of people applying for job adverts, we found that candidates who are passively in the market are being bombarded with messages. So what does this mean for an employer? Well, you've got to think carefully. Firstly, what does your talent pool look like? You know how many people are in that talent pool. But furthermore to that, how are you crafting that message? How are you thinking about making that message really engaging? How is it going to stand out for the noise? What you're going to put in there about your culture? How are you going to get that candidate that you've sent a message to, maybe on LinkedIn, or you found them on a job board? How are you going to get them engaging with you in the first place? So it's really important that you're thinking about that strategy. And I guess the actionable takeaway from this point is to recruit effectively in this market and to recruit the very best sales professional. It's important that you've got a well-rounded strategy to access both the active side of the market, so get as many applicants as you can coming through, but you're also thinking about the passive market too, because arguably that's a larger section of the talent pool at the moment. Two, I wanted to talk about this because again we felt it was important, about how looking beyond the CV can give you access to a wider selection of talent. I think you wanted to lead on this one, didn't you, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been working throughout the pandemic, and obviously it was tough recruiting in that year, 2 years, arguably now again, for obvious reasons. But what it's done is shifted companies' mindsets, especially in my sector within the technical markets. That's construction, mechanical, electronic engineering type businesses. They became a lot more risk averse, and I still see that today. What I mean by that, it's in their candidate selection process and the types of people or perceived types of people they want in their businesses. If they were going to replace a leaver or grow, which obviously didn't happen a lot, but they were really going back into that square peg, square hole mentality, which, I can completely understand. It became a case of the black book of contacts, the risk averse hiring strategy, that we need someone to come in and basically save our skins, bring a load of business out of nowhere that they've taken from somewhere else. And it became a bit safe and a bit obvious. And that was very CV driven, I'm afraid. What's that done is really it's tightened up talent pools. It's forced companies that have those people to throw cash at them potentially when it comes to benefits packages, counter offers. I had a really big one in January of 2022. I think you might remember it, Mike, because
Do you remember it?
It was a major one. I was working with one of my national clients, major global organization within the electrical and cable world, and they were recruiting for a BDM. We identified the candidate who actually ended up being a passive applicant, like you touched on before, Mike. Got through the interview process. They offered him the top end of their salary bracket, verbal acceptance. He even signed the paperwork and sent it back with the start date. When it came to that resignation piece, his company were obviously gutted and dumbstruck and thought, we're in a bit stuck here, and gave him a £17,000 pay rise like that in order to keep hold of that talent because of his commercial experience and, more importantly, his technical know-how and skill set. Started a real trend in 22 of salary expectations rising, and those types of individuals that were so wanted and needed, that passive talent pool, not actually needing to look.
Yeah. Okay. So if we look at this section as well, I think it's also important that employers are thinking about the front end of the process. So looking at the actual brief that they're taking to market, because one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing and we're hearing all the time is I'm not getting enough CVs through. I'm not getting access to enough candidates, and this can sometimes be a multitude of reasons why. One being, the job advert is pushing towards the ideal rather than what they'll actually recruit. So it's really important, I guess, as an employer recruiting in the market, that they're thinking about how are we attract the individual that we want, what sort of attributes are we looking for, looking at their top performers and thinking not just what have they sold and who to before joining us, but thinking about what do they do really well at the moment, what sort of transferable skills should we be looking for in order to maybe access a wider selection of talent. Because again, some of the reasons that companies will struggle to recruit is because they're simply not looking outside of the marketplace. They're recruiting for experience rather than recruiting for skills, attitude, and overall potential.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it really did. The example I gave before was obviously a small example within a bigger world, but it really did take the human element out of the recruitment process, and we're still seeing that now. Ultimately, that the pandemic's changed the way we live our lives day to day. It's also changed massively the way we do business, but it did change for the negative. That brief. So absolutely everything you're saying there, looking inside your organizations already, and who are your top performers? What did they do before? But forget that. What is it that actually, from an attribute point of view, makes them brilliant at what they do? And
Yeah.
I did have this again, better, more positive example of what happened here. It was around this kind of time. It was actually 6 months prior to that, in summer of 21, when we were slap bang in the middle of the pandemic, working with a major manufacturer in the construction sector of exterior building products. And they were looking for an area sales manager because they had a leaver. But for years, they've had this square peg, square hole mentality. It's always worked for them in pre-pandemic recruitment. They weren't able to pay the additional money needed, where an extra 5, 6, 7K on the basic salary, because of the rising inflation of these salaries, etc. That would have had a big impact on their wider organization and other people. So I had a real sit down with them and said, well, what have you been doing? Well, 2 or 3 recruiters on it, like we talked about before, LinkedIn adverts, looking for that ideal profile. And guess what? Couldn't fulfill the position.
Yeah.
So we had a real frank conversation about, well, what are you looking for? And they told me, and it was, of course, we want exterior building products, selling to merchants, yada, yada, yada. But why? Oh, because that's what we've always done.
Yeah.
Talk me through your top performers, guys. And the next thing you know, within half an hour, we were talking about personalities, we were talking about hunger, desire, team spirit, all of these good things that are not particularly viewable on a CV, but of course, the wider human being thing. Next thing you know, they employ a guy from completely outside of the construction sector. 18 months down the line, i.e. a couple of months ago, been promoted within their organization. That would not be heard of 5-10 years ago. And now they're looking for that similar profile because they can identify it, because they took the step out of their comfort zone. And now they know that recruitment process is going to be a lot shorter than the 3, 4, 5 months it took last time. So yeah, it's really about identifying those softer skills and not necessarily relying on what the CV says, I suppose, to open that talent pool up to you.
Yeah, soft skills. How many times do we hear it where companies who describe the top performers, they very rarely describe what sales background they've come from. Always describe characteristics, drive, enthusiasm, energy. These are all things that you can't see on a CV. So when we're talking about looking beyond the CV, this is essentially, where we're going with this point. Rob, what are some actionable takeaways here then?
Well, for me, I suppose there's 3 key ones here to talk around this opening up of a talent pool and maybe opening the door to different people joining your organization. I mean, we've just basically talked about one whereby it's looking outside of the norm and looking outside of your industry, which again, have a conversation internally about what those skill sets are that you guys identify with that you can then look at in people outside of that. Secondly, I'd probably say make that job profile friendlier to the wider market. Again, touching on some of the points you said before. Have a focus in your advertising campaign and your go-to-market strategy about the softer skills, about how open-minded you are, about the cultural aspects of your organization, rather than you must have done X for X amount of years and have a degree in X, Y, and Z, because that is going to alienate so many people.
Yeah.
If for whatever reason, though, you don't have that talent pool, you don't have that talent pool, and it isn't just going to come out of thin air, what about changing that strategy to maybe entry level? change the brief of the role. Rather than change the brief of the candidate profile, change the role, make it friendlier to someone who's maybe their first role in sales, maybe look down the graduate recruitment option, and then bring them on a journey over 2, 3, 4 years to get them where you need to be, especially in those sectors that I deal in mechanical, electrical, and technical sectors. There's a dearth of candidates that just aren't there because of different social and political factors.
3, and one that I'm excited to dig into. It's always an interesting topic of conversation, but the importance of having a time efficient and effective recruitment process. So I'll let you kick this one off, Rob.
Well, taken for granted a lot of the time, I think it's fair to say. The last thing any hiring manager I've ever spoken to wants to be doing is recruiting, unless they're an internal talent acquisition specialist, of course. But from a sales director, sales manager, HR manager's perspective, they're mostly already stressed and stretched in terms of their workload. So this is really important for them to obviously reduce that time to hire and not have it, spin on and on, which we see so often. Also, it's not just pressure on that and those individuals in that recruitment process. It's also about attracting the talent to come into that recruitment process, and it's got to be fluid. It's got to be straightforward and efficient, because the more of those things that it is, the more committed and engaged candidates you're going to get into that process. And obviously you get people that want to be in it, rather than, like we talked about, those passive applicants before, Mike. You want to engage them to get them in it and want to be in it, rather than be in it because someone told them it was a great idea. And I think a really great way of getting to the bottom of having that time efficient and effective recruitment process is really sitting back before the process even starts and understanding in your organization who is responsible for every step of that process. I mean, I think you'll probably agree with me, Mike. A lot of businesses or people we speak to, recruitment is not something that gets taught in the management manual, is it? It's not something that there is a craft of doing for every single type of role. It's about living and breathing that market day in, day out. And people forget parts of the process, or, as I say, take some of them for granted. So we need to know who's signing it off. Who's going to write the actual specification, that message we talked about before? Who's posting the adverts and where? Are you guys going to deal with recruiters or not? And if so, who manages that relationship, and what do you want from a recruitment partner? Who's then going to collect all the applicants, and who's going to manage that process? Sometimes it's quite disjointed. What's your screening process? Who's going to then be in the interview panel? How many stages are you going to do, and where? And we'll talk about the ever-changing role of that shortly. But more importantly, when are those interviews going to be, and how sharp can you get through that process?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a trend. If we look at the clients that we recruit for, and some of our clients recruit easier than others. And that's down to a multitude of factors, but there are some constants across that, and you tend to find that clients that have got a organized and well planned out recruitment process before they even go to market tend to recruit easier. And also, critically, especially in the market they're in at the moment, when we've discussed before about being a candidate driven, that it's a flexible and it's an agile process. What I mean by that is the process isn't rigid insofar as first interviews are going to be 200 miles away from where the candidates live, and there's no flexibility on interview date or location, versus we can do first interviews over Teams and seconds if needed. I think the companies that have got a slick, time efficient and effective recruitment process are those that are putting the candidates in the centre of it and thinking, right, what's the best way for us to make that candidate journey both enjoyable but friendly as well? Because at the end of the day, you want to fill your vacancy. So gone are the days where, unfortunately, candidates will travel up and down the country for first interviews, because of the way the market is at the moment, being that it's candidate driven, it's super competitive on the employer side. It's really important that we're thinking about how can we get candidates in front of us in a quick way, and a way that is going to be enjoyable for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it has to be a learning experience for everybody as well. And one of those other big things that we haven't talked about just as yet, but it's that feedback process as well. How many companies have you spoke to over the years, Mike, that have quite a faceless recruitment process with little to no feedback at the end? And that again goes back into that employer branding that we talked about before. And quickly can a company get a reputation for not being a very friendly recruitment process, and again alienating that already quite small talent pool. I mean, a really good piece around this not so long ago actually with a client of mine who have traditionally found it tough to recruit. And that, again, you talked about a multitude of factors. That the reason they found it tough to recruit is because they are in the construction sector. They have a team of specification sales managers based externally, but the way that they do their sales process is not, I'm going to call, traditional. And as a result, 95% of the specification sales professional talent pool would sell or specify in a certain way. These guys have got a much more collaborative team-based approach with a lot of inside salespeople. They've found over the years it's been difficult to get people engaged because they don't get it, they don't understand it, or they don't resonate with their business values. But also, a bit like what you said before, expect face-to-face all the time in their office based in the southeast. So ultimately, I picked up this role with them in the south. Again, a tough role to recruit for at the best of times. From a package perspective, it wasn't paying the massive money that a lot of companies have had to do, as we've talked upon.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they listened, wanted the help and support, and adapted their process. So rather than have a two-stage rigid interview process, we actually elongated it. And I wouldn't usually say that, but the way we elongated it was first stage online interview out of hours with the sales director, because she was really flexible and wanted candidates to see how flexible their business was. That was a great win at the front end. Everyone that got involved in that process was really happy with that. Secondly, meet her boss, the MD. But again, on Teams, he's based in the Midlands, couldn't come to the south of the UK, didn't expect candidates to go to him, didn't want to wait a week, made that happen. And then the third stage, because that applicant that actually got the job was so engaged with them, really found how good this was and how flexible and agile it was prepared to go to their head office for 3 or 4 hours and get to meet all of the inside team that they'd be dealing with day in, day out.
Yeah.
They offered him the job on the day and he accepted there and then because of how friendly the recruitment process was, the fact that they were looking at other things rather than just skill set on a CV, but also how welcoming and engaging it was, and a learning experience for him. And he's been there 3 months now and already settled in so much better than people have in the past because they didn't have that two-way recruitment process.
Yeah, all really good points. I guess some actionable takeaways from my end on this, I'm sure you'll have some, Rob, is if you're a client, reflect on the recruitment process and think, how accessible and friendly is this if I was going through it? Secondly, before you start the process, make sure you've got your interview times and dates that are nailed down. If you're working with a recruitment partner, and we're going to come on to this later, it's important so that they know when they need to focus on the actual role and resourcing candidates for it. But thirdly, and it's a point that we've not actually mentioned, we've discussed the candidate market being super driven. It's even more important that employers are doing a really good job of selling your opportunity, culture, benefits to the candidate when they're in front of you. And it goes back to this whole piece of making the journey enjoyable, a learning experience, and friendly. It really is about getting the candidate bought in, because good candidates are in short supply, as we've discussed. So it's important to ensure that interview process is all of the things that we've said. Yeah. Anything you'd add there, Rob?
Oh, absolutely. I think just on that piece about looking inwardly at your own recruitment process, I think that the key question to ask yourself is if you were in that passive applicant market at the moment, would you be engaged by your own company's recruitment process? Now, you're probably going to say yes to that. And if you do, speak to your peers, whether it's in the leadership team or even the wider organization. Ask them, would you be, engaged and enjoy this process? Because I guarantee there'll be some great learnings from within your organization that can make that even better for you.
Okay, so point 4 that we wanted to talk about is the importance of being aware of your talent pool, also how your employer brand is perceived in the market, and how evaluating the candidate journey can give you access to a wider selection of sales talent. So the reason we both felt that this topic overall was important is if we look at the companies that again are recruiting well, it's typically because they've got these points nailed. They understand the talent pool, how big it is, what they can recruit from it. They understand how to advertise the jobs in order to attract talent from the talent pool, and they've got a real good grip on the brief in terms of what they're looking for. They've also got a strong employer brand, so they're focusing on all the right stuff, and they're constantly evaluating the candidate journey to ensure that once they've got the candidates in the process, they keep them in the process and they don't lose them, opposed to companies that may be struggling to recruit, and it generally is because they're not thinking around these topics. They'll find it hard to get people through the door. They're losing people mid-process, or even they can't get applicants through because when people go onto the LinkedIn page or their website, there's not enough information there to draw the candidate in. This is definitely worth talking about, because the companies with the strong employer brands are those that do draw the candidates in. The companies that aren't really thinking about this or focusing on it find that they actually push candidates away. So you can have, the best written job advert on all the major job boards, and candidates can apply to it and they can look at the advert. Then they can think, right, I'm going to learn a little bit more about this company now. It's worth also remembering on this point that candidates can find out more about your company in 20 minutes than they could do previously through an interview with you. There's that much information out there. So if candidates then land on your LinkedIn page, they look at other social media platforms, maybe your Facebook or your Instagram, they go on the website, and they're not then getting a feel for your culture. They're not getting a feel for good news stories. It might not even be up to date. Then the chances are they're going to pull away from potentially applying for a position with yourselves. Whereas if your company's got a strong employer brand, then when the candidate visits your LinkedIn page, visits your website, they're going to be really enthused and be like, wow, this looks great. So
Yeah.
Rob, if we look at the talent pool, why is it important that employers are aware of the talent pool before going to market with a vacancy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I've used the word complacency before within this webinar, and absolutely you can get that way. Just expect, maybe have an air of arrogance that, well, we are who we are, so people will want to work for us. But if we don't know how big that talent pool is, then that message will get lost because no one will hear it, and ultimately we talked about working closely with your recruitment partners potentially before. It's extremely important to understand that talent pool. I mean, what I've done here is used our partnership with LinkedIn Insights. I talked before about utilizing your recruitment partners if you are using them. Hopefully they've got access to such a great piece of kit, which can ultimately show us via LinkedIn profiles in the UK how many people there are in a sales and business development piece, which is over 3.5 million. But I think where it really stands out here, Mike, obviously knowing that talent pool is what you're up against. You can see that there's over 56,000 vacancies online at the moment, and over 400,000 people have changed jobs in the last 12 months. As a result, creates a very high demand hiring piece across the UK. If you don't know that going into posting that advert, then your results will be significantly less, because as we talk about and continue to develop the idea of employer brand and advert writing, etc., you are going to be lost in that unless it's very, very good. And then if we do something a bit more local, so looking at it from a regional perspective, we're based in Manchester, but of course we're a national organisation. Me and Mike just happen to be here, so I've used Manchester as an example. But if you're looking to hire a sales professional in the Manchester or greater Manchester region, it's tough. 1,700 vacancies out there. Lots of people have already changed opportunities in the last 12 months. And of course, there's only 62,000 professionals. Sounds like a lot, but when you're really needing that quite specific skill set potentially, it becomes very small very, very quickly.
That too, as well, planning for going to market, because if you have got a brief that is a bit more specific, because maybe it's a business critical role, maybe you don't have the time to be able to train someone up in the product, in the service, then and you think, well, I need someone who's from my industry that's sold to the same end users, same decision makers, then it's really important that you're aware of how big that talent pool is. the impact of not knowing that can extensively increase your time to hire, which is really important for companies generally, because everyone wants the roles filling really quickly. But if you're going to market without knowing how big the talent pool is in the first place, then that's an issue, especially if the brief is somewhat specific. And I guess when we talk about employer branding, it is a bit of a buzzword, isn't it, Rob? And companies have emphasis on it, but not always. Most companies have heard of the word, they're thinking about it, but how many companies are always evaluating it and thinking before they go to market with the vacancy, actually, how is our employer brand at the moment? So I think the final piece on this section, we wanted to give some actionable takeaways on employer branding. Some of the tips of the things that companies can do internally is send a survey out to your current employees across the business, get them to rate the employer brand. What do they think of it? What drew them to work for you as a company? What would they say to their friends about the business, and the employer brand? What would they improve? The survey can be anonymous, but you'll be amazed how much information you can get back from your own employees. And then if we think about externally, most candidates start to perceive your employer brand usually through LinkedIn or another social media platform. So this sounds really basics, but sometimes the basics and the most simplest things are the most effective. But make sure your LinkedIn profiles are up to date. Make sure the company LinkedIn page is up to date. Make sure that we've got good news stories. Have we got video on there? Video is such a great way of improving your footprint online. It's such a great way of getting people to look at your business and getting a real feel for your brand. So have you got enough on there? How are you talking about culture and progression? Are you celebrating success? Are you active across all social media platforms? When did you last test the candidate experience yourself? So you're looking at the job advert, and then you're going on your LinkedIn page and you're taking a step back and thinking about, right, how does this look? If I'm a candidate, am I really drawn to this? Am I viewing my company as an employer of choice, which is a destination that every company wants to get to? Right, so Rob, so point 5, one that I was really keen to talk about because it definitely doesn't get enough airtime, is from an employer perspective, how to maximize your relationships with your recruitment partner. So already in this webinar, we've spoken about the difference between applicants and candidates. We've spoken about employer branding. We've spoken about viewing the recruitment process, making sure it's time efficient and effective. We've also talked about ensuring that you're looking beyond the CV to access a wider portion of talent. What we've not talked about is recruitment partner relationships. Now, this section of the webinar is based on the assumption that the majority of the employers here that watching this are in partnerships with recruiters at the moment, or are indeed thinking about it. But I'm going to kick this off with an example. So last week, I was on a Teams meeting with a potential new client, a company in the corrugated packaging industry sector. They had a BDM vacancy. They've been recruiting for it for about 3 months. So using 2 recruiters, really struggling with the role. Typical problems, not getting enough CVs through, not really getting much communication from the recruitment partners that they were using, which resulted in a really long time to hire. It was costing the business money. And in this instance, the client was becoming frustrated and then thinking, well, these recruiters just aren't doing a very good job. Now, that may well be the case. Alternatively, it could be that those recruitment partners at the front end of the process haven't engaged with the client to explain to them how they can get the most out of this relationship. And this is something that we definitely pride ourselves on, because it is a partnership. It's important that the client knows how to get the most out of us, but also it's important that we know how to get the most out of the client and how they like to work. So Rob, from your end, if you can kick this off, what can clients be doing to get the most out of their relationships with their recruitment partners? Obviously, in order to get access to more CVs, more candidates, to do overall better service.
Well, absolutely. I mean, taking the example you've used there, the most obvious one that comes to the top of my mind is asking the question from the
Mm,
employer to the recruiter. Like, it's been 2 months here, guys. What can we be doing differently
yeah,
to get more? And it's as easy as daft as it sounds. In any walk of life, that kind of open conversation is going to be the bedrock to that partnership becoming a lot more effective. What do you
yeah.
think?
It's rare though, isn't it? Like,
Mm,
we were talking about this offline, weren't we? And saying that we've had a handful of companies that will actually ask the question and say, look, what do we need to be doing to 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 get more candidates? What can we do? But it doesn't get asked enough, I don't think. So that's definitely the first tip. Secondly, and this can come from both sides, recruitment reviews. So ideally, after your recruitment partner has worked on a vacancy, whether they filled it or not, sit down with them, review it. What went well? What didn't? What sort of feedback did they get from the market when they were approaching candidates with your vacancy? You can then use that information to improve on all of the other things we've said in this webinar so far, employer branding, thinking about how you attract candidates. But getting that feedback, having a recruitment review is going to do two things. It's going to give you more information on what they've done to fill the vacancy and also the challenges that they found. But secondly, it's going to make your recruitment partner feel that the relationship is closer. It's going to form a closer relationship, which can only be better, in the long term.
Absolutely, it moves it away from a transactional piece of using 3, 4, 5 agencies
Yeah.
as we saw back in 2014, 15, 16, and then it's like, oh, good, unlucky, you didn't fill it this time. Well, that's not helping that longer term strategy. And now when you get to an ever changing market as we're in now, it is biting some companies on the posterior, so to speak, because they haven't had that open conversation. I mean, following on from that as well, Mike. I mean, I think there's big element to come off what you've just said there is around trust and building that partnership. And that could be, again, through different levels of commitment. And I think the more committed your relationship is to one another as a employer and a recruitment partner, the greater the chance of success. And it sounds obvious, but obviously we see a lot of pushback from that from a lot of companies that say, oh no, this is how we're going to do it. And a lot of the time they're the ones that are struggling to win that race for talent in this market. So, I mean, in your experience, Mike, what kind of commitment can an employer give or request from a recruiter in order to enhance their chances, do you think?
Can be a whole host of ideas of subjects. I guess the most common ones, the most basic ones, if you like, could be simple things such as interview times and dates, at the start of the process, ensuring that calls are set up to selling candidates and discuss candidate profiles. Communication being one of the key signals of strong commitment. It's really important that the communication is two-way and the feedback is honest. As well, I'd be really thinking on this point as well. I'm an employer. I want to really understand what my recruitment partner's doing to find candidates. Because
Absolutely.
if you're working with a recruitment partner on a contingent basis and you're using them alongside several other recruiters, then it's likely to be an advert-led search. The closer you partner with a recruiter, the more resource they can genuinely put into a search, because that therefore mitigates their risk. And if their risk is mitigated, their chances of filling a vacancy increase, which means therefore they can put more resource. What that means to you is you get access to a wider pool of talent. So I've thought, which I understand to a point, is that if I'm an employer and I use 5 recruiters, I've got more chance of filling a vacancy. However, often what happens is the reverse is true, because if you're giving 5 recruiters an opportunity to fill your vacancy, then they've all got a 20% chance. So therefore, how can they then afford to put the resources, spend the time to really scour the active and passive markets when the chances of them filling the vacancy is so small? We can talk here about exploring exclusivity, exploring retained solutions, as and when the brief requires it. But in order to get more out of your recruitment partner, it really is thinking about how you are working with them as well. Sometimes less is more. That can mean a better service.
Absolutely. And further to that, and reinforcing what we talked about before about that employer brand, let's say you are using 5 recruiters for one particular role. That's 5 different interpretations of your company values,
100%.
profile,
Yeah.
role brief. And of course, if that talent pool, as is at the moment, quite small, you will get this 5 different messages potentially to the same candidates, which is going to have a knock-on effect to your employer brand and how you're perceived in the market. So it's another thing to really think about is how engaged you are with your most trusted partners and the ones that you believe, having gone through those actionable points we've just talked around, understanding what they can do for you, who's best suited to you, and of course then putting your effort and your trust and resource into those guys.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Finally, then, our 6th point, we wanted to really finish off this piece around the back end of the process. We've talked a lot about the front end, but we want to really talk about mitigating the non-starter and, of course, setting them up for success medium to long term. I mean, I often say to clients when I get an offer through for an applicant, one, it's joyous, but they think the job's done. And I say, no, the hard work actually starts now. And they're always really perplexed. And they're like, what do you mean? Well, there's a lot of controllables, but there's also much more uncontrollables. And we've got to mitigate those and control the controllables.
Yeah.
I think colloquially, I've heard a lot of companies that I've spoken to, and you mentioned that you've spoken to some clients recently, Mike, that were using other agencies or not at all, more often than not. They have instances of non-starters a lot more now than they would in what we would describe as a normal year, i.e. pre-pandemic. And things like counter offers, I gave that mad example earlier, but they're coming into play. Other opportunities moving faster, in terms of agile and sharp recruitment processes. Or an applicant that's accepted an offer, has signed the paperwork, ready to go, but they get a bit jittery in between because of a lack of communication or direction, and they get a bad feeling, which obviously we don't want. I often say, we talk a lot about ghosting on social media, but companies tend to have a bit of a Casper the Friendly Ghost piece because these candidates do go off the market and they're like, why? And they don't understand. So yes, it's frustrating. Yes, it loses you time, loses you money. And it also is another reason as well why people that do start can sometimes not pass their probation. And ultimately then they either blame the person, the recruiter or whatever. But in reality, these things can be mitigated and avoided, but not always. Obviously, severe mitigation at best. I mean, I had a company approach me it was actually pre-Christmas. They had a candidate that they'd got through offer stage, was due to join in January, and that's because they had a 3-month notice period. And that's something else that's a lot more prevalent and common now that wasn't 6-7 years ago. They had a phone call an email from this individual a week before they were due to start, so 11 weeks into their probation period, whereby they joined somewhere else. Absolute devastation. I had a real frank conversation with that company. Said, out of curiosity, what did that process look like? How often were you in touch with them? They weren't really in touch with them at all, and this completely blindsided them. So now, after 4 months of a full recruitment process and then obviously a 3-month notice piece, they're back to square one. 6 months down the line, killer. Bet you've had that a few times, haven't you, Mike?
Not as frequent, thankfully, but it happens, and non-starters do happen. And look, we won't be able to mitigate every single one of them because we're dealing with people.
Absolutely.
It's both a blessing and a curse of recruitment, as I'm sure you would agree. But there's definitely in talking about what happens once they've signed that contract, because just because they've signed that contract and accepted, there's still a lot of work to do. And if we look at what can turn a candidate off in that period of time, it can be slowness in getting the offer contract letter out. It could take a week, 2 weeks to get a contract letter out. That is going to give the candidate some nervousness and some jitters because they want something right and say they've got a job first and foremost, but it's a representation of the business and the communication levels in the business. Look at some of the other reasons as to can cause a candidate to drop out. It can be a lack of communication. What we always advise clients is to set contact points So if your candidate is starting in 4 or 5 weeks' time, set points to call them after week 1, after week 2. Send them some information that they could start looking about in reference to the company. Get them talking to people in the team. We've even had, because we're in January, we had a few clients that invited new starters onto their Christmas parties. It's not for everyone, but it's a way of keeping people engaged. And then it's about the onboarding process. This sounds like basics, but making sure that the candidate knows where they're going on the first day. Have we got the laptop? Have we got the tech all sorted? That introduction into a business has to be smooth. Have we got an induction plan in place? What does that look like? How aware of is the candidate of what that entails, so it gets them excited? But it's super important that fundamentally the candidates are engaged in the business after they've signed the contract, and that everything is in place for when they start, so that we don't get to a point where we've done all this good stuff, we've got our adverts right, we've got our recruitment process right, our employer branding spot on, we're working with our recruiters in the right way, and then we drop the ball at the last minute. And this can happen from time to time, but there's definitely things that we can be thinking about doing in order to mitigate it. And it's, if we're setting up contact points for a candidate to get back to us, that's also a test of commitment on their end. So there is going to be an issue. It's not a surprise. The person isn't emailing you the day before they're due to start saying, sorry, I'm not starting now. So it's beneficial from that standpoint as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and a really good actionable tip there, Mike, and others as well. Again, can seem quite obvious, but we have it quite a lot of times, especially that offer processes. When you're getting an applicant or applicants, if you're lucky enough to have more than one at second or final stage, have the contract drafted up ready to go, because ultimately all you'll need to do is, as soon as you've made that decision, preferably on the day as to who you're offering the role to, and you know that they're going to take it based on that initial fact find or conversation with the recruitment partner, have it ready to go. So it's emailed, not posted. I mean, quite a few clients are still trying to post things, aren't they, Mike? And with, again, an uncontrollable Royal Mail strikes and things of that ilk, as daft as it sounds, can stop you from getting that person over the line. But you get it emailed out, have it ready to go on the day. Don't, waste or lose time, should I say. Then also be prepared for the counter offer. A big part of a recruiter's service levels is taken for granted, in my opinion, at this point, whoever the recruiter is, because ultimately they should be and are, in our case, very close to the candidates and should have an understanding of how counter offerable they are. And if you aren't using a recruiter for whatever reason, make sure you're asking those kind of subtle questions in an interview to try and work that out, because you don't want to get blindsided. And be prepared for them. And then finally, just to reinforce that point that you said there, Mike, about the actual onboarding process. The most engaged and excited people are those that know where they need to be, what they're doing for the first week, 2, 3, 4 weeks in that role, and what pre-reading or pre-prep can they do to ensure that they, for want of a better phrase, hit the ground running in that induction process. And that will set them up as best as possible for success in the short, medium, and long term.
Yeah, great, Rob. So thank you everyone for watching that. Hope everyone got something from it. We'd love feedback as well. So is there any of these points that you'd like us to talk more about, then please let us know.
Thanks ever so much, Mike.
Thanks, Rob.